Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Crystal Confab. Today we're looking at the crystal of love, or are we? I've got a bit of an issue, to be honest, with rose quartz. I feel it's a bit like the Kardashians. It gets far more attention than it deserves because there are so many beautiful, loving crystals out there. But whenever people are talking about love, they go straight to rose quartz. So today, me and my gang, we're going to kind of unpack rose quartz, what it's good for, what maybe another crystal might be good for, and maybe throw in some surprise uses for this crystal as well. How are we today, guys?
Oh,
Really
good.
good.
Good, good, good. Now, Nicholas, I want to start with you today. Tell us a little bit. Rose quartz, it's touted as the crystal of love, but where did that come from? And do you think that's all we can use rose quartz for? Love?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. This is like my nerdy superpower is like tracking down where these like little epithets and things come from in our world. And um, just casually over the years, I noticed that like before a certain point, nobody really makes a strong connection between rose quartz and love. There might be a little kind of anecdotal stuff here or there, but it's about from the year 1985 onwards, and it's really like more frequent in the late 80s, early 90s that we start to see rose quartz called the love stone pretty universally. So at some point in the last couple of years, I decided to like intentionally do a deep dive on this. I was writing some new curriculum centered around rose quartz, and I was like, let's actually find out where this comes from. And to the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong, I would love a larger data set than I've got, but it's already pretty big. The first time we see rose quartz called the Love Stone is in like one of those classic late 80s books called Crystal Awareness by Catherine Bowman, where she just gives it, among other things, she calls it the Love Stone. However, what happened 1 year later would really cement this. And there's a kind of obscure book by today's standards, but this author was, at least at this point, quite popular. And her name is Connie Church. She released a couple of books, Crystal Clear, which if you bought it in the 80s originally came like shrink wrapped with a clear quartz crystal to go along with it. So you could do all of the exercises in tandem with the crystal. And then as a sequel in 87, so just 2 years after Catherine Bowman's first book comes out, she puts out a book called Crystal Love. And of course, it also comes shrink wrapped with a little piece of rose quartz. And throughout the book, she's constantly referring to this stone as your love stone, not saying all rose quartz is the love stone, but all the self-love exercises you're going to do are with this stone, which is now your love stone. It theoretically could have been anything, but she wrote the book about rose quartz, and that's why it really just kind of became cemented in our collected psyche as the stone of love. And I think that is a really nice entryway to talking about what rose quartz can do for us, but I kind of have like this vendetta against getting too prescriptive and reductionist about crystals. If I asked any human being to summarize their entire life in one word, they're obviously going to miss most of who they are. I could say that I am a writer, but I also wear a lot of other hats. So rose quartz, of course, is a love stone, but it does so many other things. If we look earlier in history, we start to see that, in more recent history at least, it's definitely associated with things like emotional well-being, we'll say psychological healing in like really broad strokes, which isn't too far a cry to being a love stone. Um, but the farther back in history we go, we start to see that there's actually some pretty interesting connections to rose quartz. Some of the earliest evidence that we've got of its use goes back about 9,000 years ago. In what is now modern day Iraq, we've got evidence of some carvings, things like cylinder seals and beads and a few other stuff. Here in the Americas, we find like pre-Columbian artifacts, uh, indigenous artifacts that are mostly blades carved from it, which feels like a pretty unloving application for this stone. We've got a few references in like, we'll say late antiquity, early kind of classical period, um, to stones that we think could have been rose quartz, but they weren't classified as a variety of quartz because that's not how, I mean, geology wasn't a science yet. And that's not really how stones were cataloged then. So we suspect that there might be a few evidences of this stone really being used in healing, but it wouldn't be until the rebirth of the modern crystal movement that we start to see it like used in full force. And by this point, I think one of like my favorite discussions of the activity of rose quartz comes from the writings of Michael Katz, and formerly Jenny Katz, now Isabel Morton. But and they really together in those early writings that they did, like Gifts of the Gemstone Guardians, which is now Wisdom of the Gemstone Guardians, they describe this like fourfold activity that comes from working with the energy of rose quartz. And there, it's all kind of centered around this idea of helping us deal with our unexpressed emotions. It's a stone of emotional healing, but it's not just like focused on bad things. We tend to in our, modern kind of broader community of energy healing, holistic healing, we tend to focus on resolving the stuff we don't like, the stuff we don't want. But rose quartz doesn't make a strong dichotomy between good and bad. It's about expressed versus unexpressed. So it stirs hidden emotions to help them become more accessible. It helps us really sit with them and acknowledge whatever they might be. That's going to lead us to a state of understanding of what those emotions are and where they come from. And from there, we have the emotional wherewithal to be able to communicate or express them more effectively and authentically. And we can note that, sure, that could be sadness or pain or loneliness, but it could also be joy. Like, how many times have we just had a wonderful day and then come upon a situation where it's not really appropriate to share that joy? So we like bottle it up for later, and then we forget it's there, and it goes sour on the shelf. So this is going to help us really kind of broaden what rose quartz can do for us. Now, among all of the emotions that could be unexpressed are love. And I think that's why we really think of it as a love stone today, because if our emotional body, if our psyche is so gummed up with other things that are clogging the pipes, there's no space for love to flow either. And this takes us into that space of like love as a cosmic force, not love as an emotion. Love as a cosmic force, the glue that holds the universe together, like it can't flow through us if we are clogged. So by expressing, by revealing, acknowledging, integrating whatever other emotional stuff is there, there's a room for that kind of cosmic energy of love to flow through us. And that is what allows rose quartz to be a love stone, in my opinion. It's not like a romance specific stone. We can apply it there, but that's not its sole function.
I would love to jump in with kind of a personal story that I think really illustrates what Nicholas is talking about. So, for years, for the first many years that I was working with crystals, I was not at all attracted to rose quartz. I mean, my immediate judgment of rose quartz was like boring. I'm not interested. I don't really care. I don't get what the big deal is. I don't understand why people like this crystal. I never, ever, ever felt called to it or drawn to it until I really started doing a lot of work to bypass or to work through a lot of the spiritual bypassing that we see in the wellness space in the healing arts community. So often we want to just like gloss over the things that are difficult, that are challenging, that make us uncomfortable. And, we have this way in the wellness community of framing everything in a way that truly can be a little bit toxic. And it wasn't until I started to recognize and acknowledge that rose quartz really called me in a big way. Because, like Nicholas said, it really helps us get in touch with some of those emotions that we haven't wanted to recognize. And so it allowed me to get in touch with those things, to feel those things, to be in that discomfort while offering me this like unconditional support and love and making me feel so loved as I worked through some really hard and really heavy stuff. And that relationship sort of kind of was going in the background. And I didn't really realize at the time that that's what was happening. It wasn't until later that I sort of put that together. But a little while into this process, I lost my grandmother. My grandmother passed away, and she and I were so incredibly close. I mean, she lived a few hours away, um, but we talked almost every single day on the phone. She was so important to me, is so important to me. And when she died, I was really numb for the first little while. Like I didn't even know how to be in my grief. I didn't know how to tap into that. I didn't really want to at the time. I just wanted to shut myself off from it, which obviously wasn't the most healthy thing, but I just couldn't figure out how to cope. And I noticed that rose quartz was calling to me consistently over and over, like wanting to be a part of what was going on for me. And when I finally allowed myself to listen to the guidance it was offering, which was so subtle and so gentle, it's almost like the stone that really met me where I was at. Because a lot of times I feel called in by a stone and I'm ready to go. I like, want to pursue that relationship. I want to get to know them. Rose quartz was so different. It was so gentle and so subtle, almost like it was just waiting for me to be ready. It wasn't pushy. And working with rose quartz in my practice at that time, just sitting with the stone, being in the energy of the stone, keeping a piece on my altar that I have a little, well, like Kyle mentioned last week, lots of altars all over, but for one particular altar, which is an ancestor altar, keeping a piece of rose quartz on that ancestor altar, sitting with that rose quartz to connect with my grandmother for months. I mean, for months. And it became a good friend, this piece of rose quartz. I mean, it truly was there for me in ways that even the people in my life couldn't necessarily be there for me. It was there without words. It was there just almost to bear witness and observe. And it was something that I so needed at that time. And now, Rose Quartz and I have the most amazing relationship. And this is one of my most favorite treasured pieces right here. And I just love the energy that it brings into my space and really reminding me to be present with my emotions, even the ones that are uncomfortable.
I think maybe what we need to do is we might need to unpack the word love. In other languages, there are many different words for love, and we have different loving feelings. I love you guys, but I have different loving feelings for you guys than I do for my partner, as opposed to my cat, as opposed to my mother, and so on. Where I personally feel that rose quartz is really good in those words, kind of that nurturing love, that supporting love, that healing love, that forgiving love. It's got that gentle energy. Where I do love rose quartz, I don't totally kick it out of my life. It was actually the first crystal that came into my life. Not mine, but when my mother separated from my father, she kind of got into the new age a little bit before me, and she bought herself a rose quartz that would sit on her bedside table. And that's the only thing I've asked her that I'd like to inherit when she passes, kind of thing, because it was, so important in that nurturing and supportive way. Where I think and where I get a little bit, that doesn't quite resonate with me is when you'll see people say, if you want to attract love into your life, get a rose quartz, as in a partner. Now, we've all fallen in love at least once, and it's fiery, it's exciting, it gets the blood boiling and the butterflies going and that type of thing. And rose quartz, I find, with its soft, nurturing energy, not weak, but just nurturing, gentle energy, that would be good if you wanted to attract a lover that you're going to sit in bed and do Sudokus all day. But if you want that fire and that passion, you've got to look for something with, maybe something like a thallite, a rhodochrosite, a tugtapite. If you're looking for a bit more soul love, go for your morganite or your kunzite or something like that. But I think for me, rose quartz is that it's great to have around a space. It's great for friends. It's great for family. I love to pair it with malachite. I find malachite does a really good bad cop, good cop with rose quartz. And malachite brings the shit up, and then rose quartz will help you work through it in that way. So that's where I feel that's where it's a crystal of love, but it's not necessarily a crystal of romance.
Adam, I know that this is something that people ask about all the time because, owning a crystal shop and just being in the space, this is something customers ask me, students ask me. But I'm curious to know your opinion on this because you kind of brought this up. Like, there are so many people looking to, like, quote unquote, call love in. They're looking for the soulmate. They're looking for this, for that. What do you say to those people about how that works when we're working with our crystals?
As in, which crystals are best for that, or as in, how do we use crystals to attract love into our lives?
As in, I'm going to lead you there a little bit, I guess, but
Yeah.
I think there's a misconception that a crystal is going to be this like magic thing to fix your life, and all you need to do is go out and get this crystal, and then you're going to find your soulmate. Like that's, I think, the kind of attitude, and I think a lot of this is kind of part of what we see just from the way that people communicate and the way that we share information now with like social media and stuff like that. Everything is short snippets, little bursts of information, and so there's really not a lot of room for nuance in these conversations. But yeah, if someone is out there thinking, oh, if I want to call in that love, that soulmate love, that fiery love, I'll just go get myself the rhodochrosite and I'll be good to go. Check the box. Like, what would you say to those folks?
For me, and I know Kyle will have an opinion on this as well. I always treat crystals, they're like your friends. Your friends are there to support you, to help you in a different way, but they're never going to do it for you. So you can't get your rose quartz, your rhodochrosite, your tug to pipe, and then knock, knock, knock. You're going to get a knock at the door, and there's Princess or Prince Charming kind of thing. They support you. They help to shift your energy. They can help to move things within you. But yeah, a crystal is not going to do the work for you. They're not like Disney magic. What do you reckon, Kyle?
That totally makes sense as to what I really wanted to talk about with rose quartz, because for me, it is a stone that helps with wholeness and feeling whole as an individual, despite the anger, despite the frustration, despite the sadness, despite all of those things, allowing yourself to just be okay, loving all of the parts. And then when you love all parts of yourself, when you access all of that, when you find that balance where you're not fighting against all these parts, you can call in your partner, you can call in a soulmate, you can call in the balance, because you're not trying to find someone to complete you. You are finding someone that equals you or is a part of that journey. And that's literally how I called my husband in 20 years ago, before I even started with crystals, was basically saying to the universe, this is what I'm okay with. This is what I'm not okay with. This is what I will not compromise on anymore. And this is where I'm going to focus. Universe, take care of things, because I'm not effing around anymore. This is boring, and just expedite the situation, please, and thank you. I felt comfortable within myself. I felt good about myself, and we met within 2 weeks of me having that conversation with the universe, and we've been together for 20 years. However, my journey with rose quartz came sort of in between, maybe 5 or 6 years into my crystal journey, when I started to realize there were parts of me that I hadn't integrated. And the thing that was huge about me is that I'm actually a twin, and I have a twin that passed when we were in the womb together. And it was something that I wasn't really told about till I was older. I wasn't really, and there was always a piece missing. And it's a twin, you know it if you're a twin, if you're listening, if you're watching. It's one of those things that you don't understand until you're told about it. For my personal experience, it was like, what is this thing that's missing? What is this thing? I thought I was whole. I've got a partner, I've got great friends, I've got this work life thing that's happening that's really amazing, and there's something big that is missing. And it was rose quartz that allowed me to stop, listen, and connect to my twin sister in spirit. And I literally have a crystal skull that I work with as a connection to her, as a guide, as a link. But it was first through just a little rough raw piece that I actually found that link, and I found that connection. This is like a 15-year-old rough piece of rose quartz that I found myself just rubbing that tactile nature of rose quartz, that softness, that allowance, that just letting you feel what you're feeling. And it was like, oh, I'm feeling something missing. What is that thing that's missing? Let it come in. And it was allowing that energy of realizing I wasn't whole or wasn't feeling that wholeness to allow it to come in, and allowed me to see the world differently, experience the world differently, look at the world in a different way. And that's where I think rose quartz really comes into its own as a stone of fresh starts, new beginnings, allowing us to undertake things with gusto and enthusiasm and excitement and confidence, because we feel wholeness. We feel like we can. We feel like we are okay. We feel good within ourselves. And I think that's also a little bit about, like, scientifically, it's not the same as clear quartz, how clear quartz grows in crystal form. It grows in massive form where it's all macro crystalline and it's all interconnected. Like, it's explaining that everything is connected. There are many layers of things that make you feel good, many layers of things that make you feel bad. And if we can kind of find a bit of balance in all of it, know where you can give your energy, know where you can start pulling back, know where maybe you've been a bit excessive, know where you maybe haven't been doing enough. All of this can really come forth when working with rose quartz, because it is nurturing you, it's loving you, it's supporting you, and it's giving you that chance to kind of open up to what's there. I love it as a opening, and it's allowed me to open to a place of loving things and loving the world and loving myself in a way that I know I wasn't before, and I know I haven't. And I will go and work with, in particular, this skull every single week. If it's not every day, it is every single week. I'm working with it. I'm reminding myself of the love that I know that I have, that is there in the universe. And it's something that I also love to link with roses as the flower, stop and smell the roses and see that there is beauty there, see that there is amazing things, even if it's fleeting, even if it's just for a moment, even if it's surrounded by thorns. Like, there is still beauty there. There is still a way to connect to really amazing things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And, one thing I've found, to kind of add on to that with rose quartz, is when we are single or when there's a lack of love in our lives, we focus on, I'm not getting the love in whatever form that may be, whether it be from you want a partner, the partner you've got, whatever it may be. I'm not getting. And I have found rose quartz is a really great one for flipping the script on going, well, how can you give more love to the world? And the more love you give, not in that kind of desperate, maybe if I'm nice to people, they'll love me back, but just focusing on what you can give to the world rather than what you can receive to the world, it does help that flow really nicely as well. I do want to point out you mentioned the beauty as well. And, one myth I've heard about rose quartz comes from the Greeks and the Romans, that links rose quartz to Venus or Aphrodite. And it is said that we know that Aphrodite had a lot of love to give, as many of the Greek gods and goddesses did. And she was having a bit of a love affair with Adonis, the most beautiful man on the earth. And Mars, or Ares, the god of war, who was a little bit jealous of that, turned himself into a wild boar and attacked Adonis. As Aphrodite went to try and save him or to try and help, she pricked herself on a briar bush. Her blood fell upon some white quartz and turned it pink. So there has long been associations I've found with Venus and Aphrodite often tied in with that as well. Now, we know Aphrodite is the goddess of love, but she's also the goddess of beauty. And an old practice that I've found that is quite relevant to us here in the Southern Hemisphere coming up, because soon we have, or this week we actually have, the celebration of Beltane, which is that midpoint between the spring equinox and the spring equinox and the summer solstice. So this, in a modern day term, is your closest kind of energy to this would be your Valentine's Day. It's a time when we focus on love. It'll be when the Northern Hemisphere will be celebrating what's now called Halloween, but was once called Samhain, which is when we focus on the veil between our world and the other world is at its thinnest. There's a kind of a focus on death, whereas Beltane is focusing on love and bringing in new love and fertility and maybe making babies, if that's what you're up for, kind of thing. But there's this practice of putting a rose quartz out in the garden the night before Beltane and then getting up early in the morning, wiping the dew off the rose quartz onto your face, and it's said to make you as beautiful as Aphrodite. So I'd love everyone to give that a bit of a try and let me know how it works.
So I want to jump in because one thing that I remember reading about rose quartz, and I wish I could attribute the specific author who shared this, but in all the books I've read about crystals, I don't remember. Nicholas, if you happen to know specifically who this might be, jump in and let me know. But there is an attribution somewhere to Cleopatra going into the Nile and pulling out the cool rose quartz stones from the Nile and rubbing the rose quartz stones with that beautiful like river water on her skin, and that was said to make her so incredibly beautiful. So we see so much crossover between the Egyptians and the Greeks, and I wonder if that's one of those kinds of stories that sort of, changed who was in it, but the root of it stayed the same.
So I've seen a variation on this that suggests that to the ancient Egyptians, rose quartz was believed to prevent aging or prevent youthfulness. And there's a little bit of crossover here. If we look at the writings of Pliny the Elder, who has, some of the oldest lapidary works that we've got, there were some early transliterations, out of Roman to other languages that we see like some breakdown in the terminology used, but the stones we think might have been rose quartz that Pliny wrote about were onteros or pederos, and onteros was sometimes referred to as Venus's eyelid. And I think that's where we actually get this myth about Venus's or Aphrodite's blood staining it. The original myth is actually how roses got their color, but was reinterpreted by later authors, and even that's like a fairly recent myth in the grand scheme. But in the last like 40 years or so, that got reinterpreted as the myth of staining white quartz pink, and that's kind of modeled after the story of Bacchus or Dionysus and Amethyst, which is also a 19th century fabrication and not an ancient myth either. But yeah, we do have a few iterations of these, early seeds that were planted that I think hold space for us to have these modern tales that still speak to the same poetry. They still give us the same kind of mythic morphemes of love and beauty and youthfulness and grace and all these other things, which builds a platform for us to associate this stone with love today. But it's also more than that, right? Because Venus in her most primal form, like love was the least important thing she did. She was the goddess of the earth. She was the embodiment of the sea and the sky and the heavens. She was not just sex as a creative force, but all creation. She was the goddess of love and war and death and the very stars. She was so much more. And I think that's a lot like rose quartz. We make it just love today, but it is so much more if we allow it to be.
And I think that's even really important with the types of rose quartz we are finding now, the newer types of rose quartz, the star rose quartz that is showing both types of asterism, not just epiasterism and stuff, like the light hitting it from one side or the other. It actually shows both, but also like your lavender rose quartz, your blue rose quartz that's got didymortierite in it, that's finding these new inclusions, that's really expanding and changing the way that rose quartz works. Like the combination of dumortierite and rose quartz creating this lavendery, intuitive, loving energy, I think is really, really wonderful. And I think we're finding more complex varieties, which is showing how complex love is really for all of us.
And do you think maybe as relationships are changing these days that we're kind of going from that, that the traditional relationship of love to different ways of that? Do you think, I always find that crystals seem to emerge and bring their presence into our world at exactly the right time. There's some really interesting ones that were found around like 1996 and so on, that just as we got to that 2000 point. Do you think maybe that's why we are finding these more unique types of rose quartz now, Kyle?
I think it's really important that we are. Like, we're realizing that the traditional, you have to get all of your love and support from one person thing. Like it's not practical, it's not real. And in today's world, especially, let's throw it out the window. We have friendship love, we have pet love, we have soulmate love, we have the love of our career and our work and our plants. There are so many different things that bring love into our life that help us to see the world in a more loving way. For me, it's color, it's music, it's my cats, it's the right little things that all make me feel more loved and see the world in a more loving way. And I think we're able to access each of our own individual connections to that more easily.
One thing I find that rose quartz can help in the domain of love as well that we haven't quite touched on yet is what I simply refer to as unconditional love. And a lot of people will go, oh, yeah, I love my partner unconditionally. And I'm like, so if you got home today and they were in bed with your best friend, they'd burnt down your house and thrown out and broken all your crystals, would you still love them? And they're like, well, no way. And so my point is, that's an extreme example, but we do have conditions on love. Now, think about those of us that are in a relationship or when we've been in a relationship, how disappointed we get because they forget to pick up the milk on the way home, or they forgot it's our birthday next week, or they forget our anniversary, or different things like that. And how much we get disappointed because someone doesn't behave in a way that we expect them to. And so imagine if we could love people for exactly who they were and embrace them for that. Now, that doesn't mean that you let them sleep with your best friend and throw out your crystals. You let them do what they want to do, and you respect yourself and love yourself enough to guide your own path in what's going to be right. But if you were to love people unconditionally in that way and give them the freedom rather than putting your expectations on them, imagine what freedom that would give you to actually be yourself. Because we spend our whole lives, as young children, we're told by our parents, good girl or good boy, bad girl for different things. And so we go, oh, if I do this, I get love. And if I do that, I don't get love. And we forget to actually be ourselves. And we get to that point in our lives when we go, hold on, who am I? And I think rose quartz could actually help to bring that gentle yet powerful energy in for a bit of unconditional love as well.
Yeah, I have a mentor who often says that unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional relationships. And we can love a person, a place, a thing, a phenomenon unconditionally and still not let it ruin our lives. And I actually see this embodied in rose quartz very well. I had a colleague who always called this the stone of tough love because if we really analyze like the geology, the chemistry, the morphology, everything about it is there is a kind of inherent toughness or sharpness in this stone. It is a trigonal mineral. Those initiate change. It's a fairly durable stone. When it forms in these massive anhedral forms, it's, pretty resilient. And yet it has this like really soft color. And even like if we want to look at the color through an astrological lens, if we break down pink into its components of arbitrarily white and red, they're lunar, which is soft, receptive, and Martian, which is projective and forceful. And we see this like kind of resilience and strength in this stone. It's a stone that in like the Mesopotamian world was sometimes connected to some pretty ferocious deities, Ninlil, Enlil, Lilitu, or Lilith. So like it's not always sweet and tender, except for when we need it to be. And I find it to be a really good stone for like softening our rigidity and stubbornness, but also preventing us from being over permeable to those outside forces. And I think it comes back to this idea of experiencing love as this cosmic phenomenon, which is the only sense in which it is truly, truly unconditional, universal, divine. And if we get out of the way, if our ego self gets out of the way of that, then we can have that experience and we can still not let other people take advantage of us.
Kyle, you've talked a little bit about, there's some new types of rose quartz coming out that are being discovered, lavender rose quartz, which has got that more purple hue, the blue rose quartz, which I love, and star rose quartz, which I'm actually wearing in my pendant at the moment. But actually, are there, do we need to be careful when we're buying rose quartzes?
We do. And I'm going to tell you, if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said, watch out for the common sort of enhancements that you might see. Sometimes really low quality rose quartz can be dyed pink. It's easy to spot for the most part because the color will either be quite off and it will be noticeable. Or if you look at those natural little fissures and fractures and little cracks that you often see in a piece of rose quartz, you'll see the dye that has accumulated in those cracks as a really bright pink, bright magenta, something like that. This is most common in little stretchy bracelets, inexpensive costume jewelry, things of that nature, where they're really low quality stones. They're going to be really affordable. So just be careful when you're out there purchasing. Make sure that you're buying from a reputable source. Now, I would have told you a couple years ago that that would be the only thing you really had to look out for when it comes to rose quartz. But there are also a lot of those little same stretchy bracelets and things like that that are made of pink glass. Those can be a little harder to spot to the untrained eye, but they'll be incredibly uniform. They won't really have that same depth and character of quality that a natural stone would have. And if you look at the edge, especially of little beads where the hole is drilled, often a glass bead will look just a little different than a stone bead, especially a nice, hard, durable stone like Nicholas was mentioning that rose quartz is. The drill hole in a bead will usually be pretty clean, pretty crisp. In glass, a lot of times when you see the inside, it will be very white from where the glass was drilled out. So that's something that you can sort of look for along with that uniformity and just being a little different than what you'd expect. But the most dubious of all of the enhancements that I've seen is artificially irradiated rose quartz. Now, I just saw this for the first time. I can't remember if it was this past Tucson Gem Show in January, February of this year, 2024, or if it was last year. I think it was this year. But at my crystal shop, the store manager and I always go to shop for crystals. It is one of the biggest shows in the world. It's amazing. And we were out shopping and she was looking at some crystals in one corner of the show. I was in the other corner and she's like, hey, come over here, shop with me. So I came over and she was showing me this beautiful black moonstone. Now, albeit it was pretty dark in the tent that we were in, so forgive us that we did not catch this sooner. If I had been out in the sunlight, I have no doubt that I would have spotted this. But she picked out a few of these nice little towers of black moonstone from Madagascar. We got them back to the shop, and when we had the beautiful bright lights of the shop to make all of our crystals look so good and delicious and sparkly, I'm like, this is not black moonstone at all. This is like irradiated smoky quartz. Like, what is this? And when I held it up to a really bright light, what was so interesting is that it had that dark exterior like an irradiated quartz would have to turn it that sort of smoky brown color. But the inside, you could see a core of pink. Because there is such an abundance of rose quartz in Madagascar, I think what's happening is some of the vendors are just trying to have something different because all of them have rose quartz and they want to create these different products and do what they can do, just like we see happen pretty much everywhere, right? I'm going to cut my stuff into a different shape. I'm going to coat it with Teflon. I'm going to dye it. I'm going to whatever, just so that there's some variety out there, which there's nothing wrong with as long as it's disclosed and labeled and all that for people to know what they're buying. But these were not labeled. It was not disclosed that they were irradiated. But it was really interesting that when you held them up to a bright light, you could still see that pink core. And I'm like, they probably just took some of their lowest quality rose quartz, did a little irradiation to make it something different. They were probably trying to sell it as smoky quartz, wasn't labeled at all. We thought it was the black moonstone because similar to like when Kyle was mentioning the like lavender rose quartz that has that sort of blue undertone, this had this sort of mystical, cloudy, foggy sort of interior that made it look like sort of a high quality black moonstone. Again, in this very dark tent at the Tucson show. But you do need to sort of be careful when you're out there making some purchases. Now, there's no doubt in my mind these never would have been, labeled as rose quartz by the time they made it to a shop somewhere. They probably would have been labeled as smoky quartz, but just something good to know. And I would throw this question out to Nicholas and Kyle if either of you know. I don't know a ton about that process of the artificial irradiation. I know it's different in different places depending on exactly what they're doing and what the enhancement is. But do either of you know why the core of these little carved towers would remain pink and that color would be more saturated in the outside? Any guesses?
For me, my guess would be time, more than anything, not having the time in the irradiation to actually have it go to the core. Because this actually ties into something that I had never seen up until this year, was an irradiated lemon quartz sphere with asterism. So it has to be rose quartz that's been irradiated, because otherwise it won't have the asterism in it. I was like blown away. I'd never seen anything before. And when you look at it, it has this kind of, this is a bad example because it's quite washed out. You can kind of see banding. There's like white and clear patches, and that was very much how it looked. And it was, now I put it all together. I had no idea just because of this conversation. It's like it has to be irradiated rose quartz. Nicholas, I'm happy to love it to hear yours.
Yeah, I was actually gonna to discuss this material that I started seeing more frequently on the market, especially online, sold as citrine with asterism or astrated citrine, and it is absolutely irradiated massive quartz. Now, whether it starts as rose quartz or if it starts as like the girasol moon quartz, which is just desaturated rose quartz, structurally, they derive their optical phenomena from the same source, which are those microscopic little nanofibers of dumortierite or a closely related borosilicate mineral. We're not entirely sure, which is a fun mystery. But what's probably happening is a two-stage process with that. If it's rose quartz, it's getting blasted with irradiation, which darkens it, and then blasted with heat to lighten the color, which is, like how really fine topaz can be done, or how we can improve the color of aquamarine, which gets irradiated and it turns it this muddy, murky brown green color. But then heat treated afterwards, it lightens it to that deep crystal blue. And I think that's happening with this lemon quartz or citrine with asterism too. I nearly bought some, and I did a little bit of digging, and I was like, no, this can't be legit. And I finally found a thread somewhere on a mineral forum that confirmed the suspicion.
Mm. Now, as we wrap up today, we've talked a lot about what rose quartz is good for and what it's not good for. But I'd love to ask each of you, people have rose quartz sitting around their house. How can they actually use it, do you think? And I'll go first. Tying in with the beauty aspect of it, one of the things that is very popular, growing in popularity coming out of Asia, is using a gua sha. And I was actually, you were flashing your rose quartz around. The piece of rose quartz I use the most is a gua sha, which is that, interestingly shaped tool that we run along our face. It's beautiful and cooling. It's so smooth, but it's kind of bringing in that energy as well on a vibrational scale of that Aphrodite Venus beauty energy. So that can be a really nice way to bring rose quartz into your life. What about yourself, Ashley? How do you tend to use rose quartz a lot?
Okay, so this is a little bit weird, but this is what I've been doing lately. I make a gem water in the normal way, but I don't drink it. I don't ingest it. I actually add it to my watercolor paint water. And if I'm needing to take some time to do some emotional expression, to kind of get in touch with whatever's going on with me, I will just sit and free paint for a while using that rose quartz infused water. And it makes me feel so connected to the energy of that stone. And I love that as I'm kind of pouring my heart into this little painting, the rose quartz is actually helping me make it. All that energetically infused water is right there. Nicholas, what about you?
So I will occasionally use rose quartz as a kind of like psychic shield. So I'll usually have a physical piece to hold on to when I start the process, but I'll visualize like this robust field of rose quartz surrounding me. roughly in the shape of my aura. I try to imagine it as, more flexible than an actual rock would be. And, as opposed to other ways that we might think of protection, this isn't building a barrier that keeps everything out. It's like a selectively permeable membrane. Everything that passes through it has to be qualified by that energy of unconditional love. So if it doesn't pass the test, it doesn't get through, whether it's coming in or out. It also helps us when we want to ensure that we bring the right vibes to the situation. And that can be really useful for like when days we're just stretched real thin emotionally, we don't have a lot left to give. It just helps filter out maybe the things we shouldn't be giving in place of love.
I love that. I love that. And that makes sense to kind of how I work with it as well. So, because I have chronic pain and I deal with it every day, my body is one of the things that I don't love as much as I can. And I have a love-hate relationship. And I specifically have a couple of these bodies. And I will just remind myself that my body isn't perfect, but it's keeping all of my organs in place. It's one of my favorite mantras. And it's so simple and it just works. And it reminds me that yes, I'm in a bit of pain, but it's okay. Like I'm here, I'm standing, it's doing the job that I needed to do, and I don't have to compare it to anyone else's body.
Mm. Well, thank you very much for joining us this week on Crystal Confab. We can't wait for you to join us next week when you see how well dressed the Australians are in theme of the Crystal of the Week. Beating the Americans this week, I think, with both me and Kyle in our pink, but that's okay. We're not competitive. We won't talk about the Olympics or something like that because that'll just be embarrassing. But we will be back next week to dive deeply into another crystal. Thank you very much for joining us for Crystal Confab. Until next week, blessed be.
Bye.
See you.